The church bells still rang faintly in my ears as I stepped back into the house Harold and I had built together by Lake Champlain. The funeral had emptied me, left me hollow, as though the coffin had carried away not just my husband, but also the air I needed to breathe. Friends and neighbors had offered embraces and promises to call, but once the last car pulled out of the drive, silence settled in like a heavy fog. I walked slowly through the rooms, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of photographs, searching for his presence in the little things. His study door was half open. For years I had left that room to him, his papers, his tidy rows of books, the scent of pipe tobacco still lingering in the curtains. Tonight, it pulled me in. I sat at his desk, my fingers brushing the oak surface worn smooth by decades of use. The drawers opened easily, filled with pens, files, and old receipts, until one resisted. A small brass lock glinted back at me. I remembered the tiny key he had once kept on his watch chain. My hands trembled as I searched through his cufflinks box and found it there, waiting, as if he had meant for me to. Inside lay an envelope marked only with my name. My breath caught as I unfolded the pages in his steady handwriting. My dearest Eleonora, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. There is something I must warn you about. Seraphine's smile may be warm, but her eyes tell another story. Do not sign any papers she places before you. Promise me you will always consult Alcott before agreeing to anything. And remember the second account we opened years ago. You will need it. Trust your instincts. They are sharper than you believe. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Harold had doubted her too. All those times I told myself I was imagining the edge in her voice, he had seen it. I folded the letter carefully, the weight of it pressing into my chest. The house felt different now, less safe, as if shadows had shifted. I rose from the desk, carrying the letter close, and walked toward the wide echoing hall where tomorrow would bring the first visit from Adrian and Seraphine. The morning after Harold's funeral, the cedar walls of our house seemed to groan under the weight of their emptiness. Each step I took echoed back to me, as though the house were trying to remind me that I was now its only occupant. I made tea and set 2 cups on the table out of habit, then put one back with a bitter laugh. Silence has a way of amplifying every small grief. By mid-afternoon, I heard the tires of Adrian's car crunching on the gravel drive. I smoothed my dress, pushed Harold's letter deeper into my pocket, and opened the door. Adrian kissed my cheek, his eyes damp with the remnants of sorrow. Behind him, Seraphine breezed in, her perfume filling the air, her heels clicking across the floor like punctuation marks. She glanced around the entryway, her gaze sliding up the staircase and across the high-beamed ceilings. This place is far too big for one woman, she said with a sigh, setting her handbag on the console table. Think of the upkeep. Heating, cleaning, security. It must be exhausting. I forced a smile and murmured something about managing. Adrian shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. We sat for tea, though Seraphine hardly touched hers. She asked about Harold's pension, about whether I had thought of downsizing. Adrian changed the subject, but her questions lingered in the air long after they left that evening. Later that night, I climbed the stairs slowly, my hand brushing the rail Harold had polished every spring. I passed the closed door of our bedroom and paused, hearing faint voices below. Curious, I stepped back quietly, holding my breath. Seraphine's voice floated up through the air vent, low but edged with impatience. We need to start unlocking assets sooner rather than later. She doesn't need all this space. Adrian, it's wasteful. His reply was muffled, hesitant, a man torn between loyalties. I closed my eyes, clutching Harold's letter against my chest. His warning no longer felt like paranoia. It felt like prophecy. Tomorrow I would begin to watch more closely. The days after that conversation blurred into one another, the house still humming with absence, yet Seraphine's presence became more constant, almost as if she were trying to fill the silence Harold had left behind. At first she came with Adrian, carrying a casserole or insisting on helping me tidy the kitchen. Soon, though, she began arriving on her own, her knock sharp, her smile practiced. "Eleonora," she said one Tuesday morning, settling herself in Harold's old chair as though it already belonged to her. "Have you ever looked into assisted living resorts? They're not like the nursing homes of the past. Think of them as vacation communities, pools, social clubs, medical staff right there when you need them." I folded laundry while she spoke, each word sounding less like comfort and more like strategy. "I've managed well enough here," I replied softly. She tilted her head, her eyes roaming the room. "Yes, but how long can one woman really keep up a property this size? Adrian worries about you." The mention of my son's name struck deeper than her rehearsed concern. When he came with her, he rarely contradicted her. He would stir his coffee, glance at his phone, and let her words hover in the air unanswered. Silence, I realized, can wound as deeply as cruelty. Her visits grew bolder. She asked where I kept my insurance policies, whether I had a living will, if my accounts were joint or separate. Each question sounded casual, but Harold's letter echoed in my mind. "Do not sign anything. Trust your instincts." I began keeping notes in a small ledger, writing down the dates she came, the words she used, the moments Adrian avoided my eyes. It gave me a strange sense of steadiness, as though Harold and I were still working together to protect what was ours that night. As I tucked the ledger beneath the drawer with his letter, I whispered into the empty room, "I see what you saw, Harold, and I will not let it slip past me." The next morning brought a revelation from an unexpected source. The next morning began with the scent of damp cedar drifting in from the lake. I stepped onto the porch with my coffee, grateful for the stillness, when I heard the familiar shuffle of Mrs. Calloway's shoes on the gravel path. She had lived next door for 30 years, a retired librarian whose eyes missed nothing and whose tongue rarely bothered with pleasantries. "Eleonora," she called, clutching her cardigan against the breeze. "I thought you ought to know something I saw yesterday." Her tone tightened my stomach before she even spoke another word. "I was trimming my hydrangeas when I noticed Seraphine in your backyard. She wasn't alone. A man was with her, tall, carrying a clipboard, and he had a measuring tape. Looked an awful lot like a realtor to me." The mug shook slightly in my hand. "Are you sure Mrs. Calloway?" adjusted her glasses. "As sure as I've ever been. They were pacing the property line, taking photos. I figured you had invited them, but then I realized you weren't home." I forced myself to nod, though the air seemed to thicken around me. "Thank you, Margaret. I appreciate you telling me." Her gaze softened. "Be careful. I've seen too many families turn sour when money is involved." She gave my arm a quick squeeze before heading back down the path. I stood frozen on the porch, Harold's warning echoing in my ears. Trust your instincts. The letter, the probing questions, the sudden visits, it was all falling into place. That afternoon, I retrieved my ledger and began writing with a steady hand. May 14th. Seraphine seen with possible realtor. Measuring property without my consent. I noted the time, the witness, every detail Mrs. Calloway had given. Filing the page away, I felt a shift within me. Fear was giving way to clarity. If they meant to treat my home like merchandise, then I needed to be prepared for the next move. That resolve carried me into Sunday dinner, where words sharper than any measuring tape would finally be used against me. Sunday dinners had once been Harold's favorite tradition. Roast chicken, laughter, the sound of grandchildren dropping forks and asking for more bread. Now the table felt colder. Though I had tried to preserve the ritual, Adrian carved the meat with mechanical precision, while Seraphine poured herself wine, her bracelets clinking in the silence. She didn't bother with small talk. "Eleonora?" she began, her voice as crisp as the lettuce wilting in the bowl. "We need to be practical. You're becoming a burden. It's time to think about a nursing facility." The word landed like a stone in the pit of my stomach. I set down my fork, waiting for Adrian to object, to remind her that this was my home. Instead, he lowered his eyes, busying himself with the potatoes. His silence cut deeper than her cruelty. Seraphine leaned forward. "These places aren't like the old asylums. They're modern resorts. You'd have activities, care, friends your own age, and it would give Adrian peace of mind, knowing you were looked after properly." I searched my son's face for even a flicker of resistance. There was none. Only the dull acceptance of a man unwilling to confront the woman beside him. I excused myself from the table before my voice betrayed me. Upstairs, in the solitude of my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed where Harold and I had shared half a lifetime. His letter was in my nightstand, the ink already worn by my fingers. "Do not sign anything. Trust your instincts." I opened the closet and pulled out the small suitcase we once used for weekend trips. Into it, I folded a few dresses, my medicines, and the framed photograph of Harold laughing in the garden. Each item felt like a quiet vow: I will not let them decide my future. By the time the moon rose over the lake, the suitcase was zipped and standing by the door. Tomorrow, I would seek counsel, not comfort, and Harold's warning would guide every step I took from here. The following morning, I carried my suitcase not to the bus station, as instinct urged, but to the office of Mr. Alcott. He had been Harold's college friend, and over the years had handled everything from our first mortgage to the incorporation of Harold's small contracting firm. His secretary ushered me in without delay, her eyes softening when she saw the tension in my face. "Eleonora," he said, rising from behind his desk. "I was hoping you'd come see me." I sat, the suitcase resting at my feet like an anchor. Harold warned me, in a letter, before he died. He was worried about Seraphine, and he was right. I can't ignore it any longer. He listened without interruption as I explained the probing questions, the measuring tape, and finally, the words at dinner. When I finished, he folded his hands, his expression grave but calm. "You've done the hardest part, recognizing the danger. Now we'll make sure you're protected." Together, we reviewed every account, every investment, at his direction. I authorized the transfer of nearly everything into the secondary account Harold had once set up. Offshore, secure, beyond the reach of anyone without explicit authorization. From my local account, I left only enough to cover utilities and groceries, a decoy balance that would give Seraphine the illusion of control if she ever managed to glimpse it. Then came the will. With a steady pen, I removed Adrian and Seraphine as primary heirs. In their place, I established educational trusts for Oliver and Maeve, my grandchildren, funds that would be locked until they turned 18. The remainder I directed to charitable foundations supporting widows and abandoned seniors, people like me who had been cast aside. When I set down the pen, my hands were trembling, not from fear, but from resolve. Mr. Alcott looked at me with something between admiration and sorrow. "Harold would be proud. You've taken back the reins." I left his office lighter than I had in months, my suitcase rolling behind me, not as baggage but as a companion. That evening, I placed it by the door once more, knowing the next step was disappearance. That night, I set a single sheet of paper on the kitchen table. The words were simple, deliberate. "I need time to heal. Do not look for me." I signed only my name, leaving it where Seraphine would be sure to find it. Then I shouldered my suitcase and stepped into the cool Vermont air, the lake glimmering faintly under the moon. At dawn, I boarded a bus bound for Maine. Each mile that carried me farther from the cedar house loosened the grip of fear. By the time the bus rolled past rocky shorelines and lighthouses, my heart beat with something I hadn't felt in months possibility. The cottage I rented near Bar Harbor was small, with peeling paint and a stubborn door. But the salty wind that drifted through the windows filled me with a fragile sense of renewal. I lived quietly at first, keeping my routine simple, but soon the community drew me in. The local library needed volunteers, and I found myself shelving books and reading aloud during children's hours. The laughter of small voices eased the ache Harold's absence had left behind. One afternoon, I brought in a worn chess set, and before long I was teaching the game to eager hands that reminded me of Oliver's. Watching them puzzle over strategies gave me a sense of purpose I thought I'd lost forever. Each evening, I walked the shoreline, the waves steadying me, the gulls reminding me that survival could look like flight. For the first time since Harold's death, I slept without the weight of dread pressing against my chest. It was in that fragile peace that news of Seraphine's unraveling would soon reach me. I later learned that while I was shelving books in the children's corner of the library, Seraphine was standing at a travel agency counter in Burlington, her nails tapping impatiently on the glass. She handed over my credit card number, the same one I had once trusted her with for groceries when Harold was ill, and smiled as she signed for a $25,000 Caribbean resort package. But 5 minutes later, her smile faltered. The transaction failed, flagged by the bank. The account, they told her, had been drained and was under monitoring for suspicious activity. She must have argued, insisting there had been a mistake. But the truth was, plain there was nothing left for her to steal. I imagined the scene the way Adrian would have rubbed his temples when she told him, the way her voice would have sharpened as panic took hold. Their debts were already strangling them, the mortgage behind, the credit cards swollen. My silence had become their undoing. Days later, a package arrived at my cottage, addressed in a child's uneven scrawl. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a crayon drawing. A stick figure version of me stood beside Oliver, his round letters spelling, "Grandma, don't listen to Mom. You're not a burden." My breath caught, and tears blurred the lines of his little son and crooked house. He couldn't have known where I'd gone, so the package must have come through Mr. Alcott, who had always looked out for me. Still, the message reached straight into the hollow part of my chest. I pressed the drawing against the refrigerator with a seashell magnet, letting its colors brighten the worn kitchen walls. For the first time since leaving Vermont, I knew I wasn't entirely alone. One young heart still carried me kindly, even as the world I'd left behind was beginning to fracture under its own weight. News of their unraveling came quietly, carried not by family, but through the careful words of Mr. Alcott. He called me one afternoon while I was shelving books at the library. "Eleonora," he said gently, "the bank has filed notice. Adrian and Seraphine are in foreclosure. They've missed too many payments." I closed my eyes, picturing the cedar house they had so often eyed, and wondered if Seraphine now saw her own reflection in those empty windows. According to Alcott, the neighbors were whispering, the same neighbors who had once envied their parties and new cars. Arrogance, it seemed, had a way of echoing louder when the walls began to crumble. Yet, spite brought me little comfort. I had already chosen a different path. Mr. Alcott spread out the papers across his desk the following week, the founding documents for the Harold Whitcomb Foundation. In bold letters, our name now stood for something more than property and accounts. It stood for second chances. The foundation's mission was simple: to provide housing support and dignity for widows and abandoned seniors who, like me, had been told they were burdens. I signed my name beneath Harold's, steady and certain. It felt less like revenge and more like reclamation, as if I had pulled my life back from hands that meant only to consume it. For Oliver and Maeve, my provisions were tucked safely away. Education funds in their names, secured until adulthood, beyond the reach of their parents' failures. One day they would understand why I disappeared, why silence had been my shield. They would know they had been protected, not punished. As I folded the foundation papers into my bag, I felt Harold close beside me again. His voice whispered in memory, "Trust your instincts." That night, under the salt air of Maine, I realized the truest form of justice had already begun to bloom in the garden I was planting for tomorrow. By summer, the garden behind my cottage had taken root, roses from Harold's old cuttings, carefully wrapped and carried from Vermont, now climbed against the weathered fence. Each bloom was a memory softened by salt air, a reminder that life could take hold even after being transplanted. I knelt among them one morning, brushing my fingertips over the petals, and let the words I had held back spill into the breeze. "I wasn't your burden, Seraphine," I whispered. "You were mine, and I've finally set it down." The tide carried my confession away, as though the ocean itself understood. For the first time since Harold's passing, I felt no weight pressing against my chest, only the steady rhythm of waves and the fragrance of roses. The cottage no longer served just as my refuge. Slowly, I began opening its doors to others. A widow from town who couldn't bear her empty house spent a weekend here, sleeping in the spare room and walking the shoreline until she found her breath again. Another woman, cast aside by her grown children, sat at my kitchen table with tea, and we talked until dawn about what it meant to be seen. It grew from there, small gatherings of women who carried invisible burdens, each one looking for proof that life after betrayal could still hold purpose. We cooked together, read aloud in the evenings, and planted herbs along the stone wall. In their laughter, I found echoes of my own healing. Sometimes, when the evenings cooled and the sea breeze lifted through the open windows, I felt Harold's presence in the hush between waves. It was as if he had guided me here, to this house by the sea, to turn grief into sanctuary. And as I stood in the doorway, listening to the voices of women rediscovering themselves, I knew my story was no longer about survival alone. It was about beginning again.